Okay, so hello everyone. If you joined us for our webinar, Dear Stop It Now, Someone I Loved Abused a Child, then you know that we unfortunately had some unforeseen tech issues, to say the least. Our guest, Elaine Spangler, was speaking to us about her own experience and subsequent journey as a spouse of someone convicted of sexual abuse when her audio went out. She's graciously agreed to a little interview with me so that we can hear further about her experience. So welcome, Elaine.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you are able to take this time to share your journey with us. So we got to hear a bit about your story before the tech nightmare, and about how your husband, whom you loved and who was a chaplain, a good father and husband, sexually abused two teenage boys. He was incarcerated and he passed away while in prison, but we didn't get to really chat about this experience. So what I wanted to first ask you was about your own kind of like wondering why process after all this came to light. What was that like for you?
Well, first of all, I say that it would have been very easy for me to divorce my husband and get away from the situation. But knew him, and I did not want to demonize him as many did, because I knew that what he did not reflect his whole being, his whole person. And so let me start with that. As I look back, he shared with me some of his childhood experiences. He was a little bit of a loner, kind of the nerdy type. He didn't have a lot of love and expressions of love and encouragement from his parents, mostly a lot of criticism. And I had sensed that his sense of self-esteem was very much lacking. But it was very difficult to see that because he was a very social person. He loved to be with people of all ages. And as I look back, I could see some of the whys or the factors that may have influenced him to offend, certainly not excusing him from his offense. I want to be clear about that. The question I still could not understand was how he could allow himself to do what he did. More so than the why, because I could see some of the factors, and after doing some of my own research and learning what some of those factors were that make people or allow people to be more likely to offend, I could see some of those factors in him. But what the question I had was, how could he allow himself to do what he did? And it defied his nature as a person, his pastoral calling, his faith. I wondered why he couldn't tell me what was going on or what he was feeling. People would ask me if I was angry at him. And to be honest, they would expect me to explode into a tirade of anger, but I was not angry at him. I was sad that he felt he could not confide in me because I was his wife. But then I also imagined how difficult it might be if roles were reversed. At the time, he had been going through a little bit of a state of depression, which certainly could have influenced things. And personally, I'm very aware of the effect that depression and addiction have on people and their ability to make good decisions. I've dealt with depression for most of my adult life, on and off. And I have to admit, I'm not addicted to drugs, but I'm addicted to food and fabric. I'm a sewer. And, when we look at the addiction process, it's similar. We do things because it gives us pleasure. It gives us a sense of fulfillment. It gives us positive feedback. Later on, Dennis told me that he recognized he had a problem. He would question himself repeatedly as to what he was doing, but he was unable to come forward and openly admit his problem. He didn't know how to get help, where to get help. He was afraid that I would leave him, afraid of losing his friends, afraid of the legal consequences, afraid of fully realizing that he had caused the harm, and also the stigma of being labeled. I've sincerely not tried to minimize the harm they inflicted, nor rationalize his actions, but try to understand the factors that led him to abuse these children. And as in my effort, I've come across a way to understand the process of, I found it helpful to think of it as a perfect storm scenario in which a vulnerable event, my husband, one who is at risk to harm a child, finds a vulnerable child and has an available opportunity. So in looking back, I can see, some of these things developing, but because I didn't know necessarily what the red flags were, or I didn't know that people that offend are just everyday people like my husband, people with respectable jobs and respectable lives and experiences. I just didn't recognize it soon enough. So that's kind of where I am as far as the why.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it shows, just how complex a situation like this truly is. I imagine that a lot of folks aren't going to immediately have that kind of answer to the question of why, but it's a rather long process. Sometimes that is something that a partner might have to kind of go through in therapy or through honest self-reflection to kind of see what had gotten them to that place. And so the next question I want to talk about is back on the webinar. If you remember, we had talked a little bit about disenfranchised grief. And just a little reminder for anyone out there, Ken Doka coined that term, and it's the kind of grief that a person experiences when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly mourned. So I'm wondering if this notion of disenfranchised grief kind of rings true for you. Did you feel that you were grieving, but you potentially lacked some of the typical either sympathy or empathy from other people? Did you feel like you may have not been able to kind of express your feelings and share what's going on because you might have been judged or looked at negatively? And did you actually have places that you could openly grieve?
Yeah, it was truly a time and a situation where you really found out who your true friends were. I was very fortunate and thankful that I have had wonderful groups of people that have supported me, my family, my church family, and many other friends. And I truly believe that having those people that I know and trust to talk to was essential in getting through this whole journey. I did not feel alone along the way because I had so many people that I knew I could count on. And I think I'm probably very fortunate and and probably the exception to the rule. I can see a lot of people being very lonely and not knowing, what to do or who to talk to. I was very selective about who I talked to about my situation for 3 reasons. One, not everybody needs to know. It was kind of an as needed basis. If you didn't need to know, I didn't talk about it. Number 2 was a fear of negative reactions, of which we had some. Some of the most difficult things to deal with are the negative attitudes and comments. The day after my husband was arraigned, the DA had a press conference in which he referred to my husband as a monster. My daughter, who was teaching in the local high school, heard a colleague say regarding situations. I don't know that he knew she was there or what. They should all be shot in the head, referring to those who sexually abuse children. I was teaching sixth graders in the local school and was asked during class by a sixth grader, "Are you related to the man in the news?" And even if the negativity was not directed at me personally, I found it very difficult to hear those things because they were talking about a person that I loved. And I think that's one of the hardest things to work through, is the negative feelings that other people have about your husband. And I know my daughters especially had a difficult time. And the third thing was, I have tried to look forward rather than look backward. I could dwell all I wanted to on, oh, what if only, but that doesn't get us anywhere. And so I early on started to deal with those things and educate myself. My husband and I knew that for us to get through this, we needed to help some good to come out of it. And that good is helping to let people know that, where there is help and how to get it.
Yeah.
I had a good pastor friend who reminded me that I was in it for the long haul. And so I kept that in my mind, that my husband was sentenced to 8 to 20 years. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system, the prison system, doesn't like to let sex offenders out at their minimum, which was the case with my husband. And that's something that very angers me very much, because he had been diagnosed with a brain cancer, incurable brain cancer, and they still refused to let him out. But that's another story.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. And I think it's really powerful that you had so many people to kind of back you up through this. I think you're right in what you said earlier, in that a lot of people feel like they're going through this all alone. So having people to kind of show up with you and people to talk to is really fantastic. And actually, I imagine, like, along the way, there probably were a lot of, challenging conversations that you must have had to have.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could kind of tell me a little bit about what you said to people in your life about what had happened and what the toughest conversation was. And if you can share a little bit with me about what the conversation was like with your kids most specifically.
Okay. Once the word was out, which was, the next day it was in the newspapers and on the local news, which was very difficult to see my husband's face up there. Talking about it with friends and family that I trusted was very therapeutic for me, although it was difficult to know how much people knew. I didn't want to tell them any more than they needed to know, but I didn't know how much they knew already. So it was kind of little iffy situations at first, until I kind of felt that through. And I tried not to have it rule every conversation. It would be too easy to just focus all my conversations on this subject. And I realized that just as there's more to my husband than just his offense, there's more to my life than just dealing with his offense. As much as possible, I expected my husband to inform those close family members and friends, including our children, who were in their mid-20s at the time and starting their professional lives. My daughter as a teacher and our son is a mechanical engineer. I can't remember too much about how that session went or how he broke the news to them, but I do know that they both continued to be very supportive of him and assured him of their love. And I think that was one of the most blessed gifts that they could give to him, was just to remind him that they love him in spite of what happened. And that my daughter had a little bit more emotional effect because she was a teacher in the school system, and there were continued to be things in the news. But what I found was my toughest conversation, I guess, was with the school district superintendent, because I was a teacher. I felt I needed to tell her personally what was going on. Thankfully, she was a kind and gracious person, and I learned that there's no easy way to start those conversations. And it was easier to simply just get it out on the table, and let them ask questions. Because it's just not easy. So you just have to, kind of like jumping in the water, cold water, And once you do that, it becomes easier to talk about it. Since then, I've also talked to many church groups and about it. And so I've been getting experience telling people.
Yeah. Well, that's really amazing, and I appreciate you sharing that. I imagine it's really difficult to bring something like this up. It's not easy to talk about. And yeah, I think I also really appreciate you just sharing the fact that this is also really important, that this isn't the only aspect of yourself that you want to share with other people. There's so much more to your husband than your sexual offense, and you also want to be seen as a whole person, and don't just want this to be the dominant conversation when you're with your friends, and maybe you just want to, hang out and talk about something else. So that makes a lot of sense to me as well. Just to further talk about the healing process a little bit, I know that you said you had your church, you had friends and family there for you, and I think that's really fantastic. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what you think is needed for healing to begin as a non-offending partner. Jenny told me a lot about how part of your healing process has kind of been to become an advocate for perpetration prevention, and to kind of look at the root causes of sexual abuse, and then to, become a little bit of a visible advocate for that. And I know that a lot of people might not be able to take those steps. So how have you been able to kind of get to that place, if you're able to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the first essential to healing is not taking it personally, and realizing that I am not the one responsible for what my husband chose to do and his actions. And it's kind of like when your kids turn 21, I tell them, when you turn 21, I just, I didn't worry about things. You're an adult, you're on your own. So it's kind of like that, I relieved myself of the responsibility. Second is to be willing to talk about it. Talking about it is therapeutic. If we hold it inside ourselves, then, it's damaging to ourselves emotionally. Holding it in, we can't forget it. It's there. Third is, as I said before, is to try to make some good come out of our tragedy, and having something to look forward to doing to help make things better. Not that you can erase what happened, but to improve things for other people in the future was very important. And I'm still working on that. And I'm thankful that Stop It Now has allowed me to accomplish some of that, because that helps me heal. And fourth is to get professional counseling if you need it, not to be afraid of getting counseling. I know there are a lot of people in this world and country that are afraid of counseling. I did get some counseling off and on, but I ended up having to bounce back and forth between several providers, and I just don't want to have to tell the whole story again to a counselor. And I think I'm pretty well under control. The only thing that I've really had a hard time doing is letting go of my anger towards the parole board by denying him parole. So that's kind of how I'm healing. And I have a dog.
Dogs and pets are very therapeutic.
They are. They are.
And honestly, I think that's really fantastic advice. And I imagine kind of, just with every other facet of maybe healing and grieving for that matter, that progress isn't always linear. I know that Candace shared a little bit about that on the webinar. And maybe even just like the need to be gentle with oneself, right? Especially in regards to things that are very much out of your own control, like someone else's behaviors, no matter how close you were to them. You had no final say over that. So one final question would be, what did you want folks to take away from this? I guess this isn't a webinar anymore, but just from this topic. If you remember, it wasn't just people who had this experience like you, who were kind of live with us, but it was also a lot of professional folks who may be kind of working alongside people who are in this situation.
Right. As I said before, one, we must talk about it personally with people, around us, talk about it with someone who we think might be offending, before the offense happens. And to realize that we're all working towards the same goal of preventing child sexual abuse. And going into the barriers, one of my greatest barrier I found was the lack of support for people who had offended. People and many social agencies and prevention programs would not accept or see that helping an at-risk individual was the best prevention. Stop It Now is one of the only ones that deals significantly with that aspect of it. And it's an essential aspect of it. I talked with children and youth locally, and they said, "Oh, we don't take care of offenders." I had a local group of people that were trying to organize a community-led networking, trying to pull both sides together and trying to, join as one. We had a very hard time getting any social agencies that were victim-oriented to participate. And so I think we need to, as a society, deal with it as a whole problem. We can't just deal with the victims. We need to deal with the at-risk offenders, because sending them to prison isn't a good solution. And I think that's probably my most important takeaway, is that we all realize we're in the same game, working for the same goal, and that we need each other to do that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that's really important and necessary to realize that punishment isn't prevention.
Right.
So we need to work together to figure out what we can do to prevent abuse before it happens. So just to wrap it up, again, Elaine, I really, really appreciate you taking this time to talk with us and to kind of fill us in after all those massive technical issues. So thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.